outside. Good evening. Thank you very much for attending the public clause-by-clause hearing today with the Department of Justice. We apologize that we're a little bit late. We had a little bit of longer day in the session, so we apologize for that. Before we start, I've asked Mr. Bolio to open up with a prayer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I will pray to the Heavenly Father today to provide us with sound judgment and to provide us with respect and dignity as we work for the people and this unfortunate group of people that this act is going to be watching over or governing, I should say, for a lack of a better word. And I pray that we are able to improve the lives of the people that we are working for today. Amen.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. Again, folks, we have one agenda item. It's a clause-by-clause review of the Corrections Act, Bill 45. Can I have a mover to accept our agenda as presented? Moved by Julie. All in favor? Thank you. Any declarations of conflict of interest? Seeing none, I'll start. At this point in time, I will ask Mr. Blake to introduce himself, and we'll go around. What's his last name?
Good evening, Frederick Blake, MLA for Mackenzie Delta. Welcome.
Hello, I'm Tom Boley, MLA for Tuneda Willowday.
Good evening, welcome, Michael Nadley, MLA for Decho.
Welcome, Julie Green, Yellowknife Center.
Good evening, Shane Thompson, Nahende. On my far left is Toby Kruger, is our law clerk. Allison Anderson is our policy researcher. And on my right is Jennifer Frankie Smith, committee clerk. Today, the Standing Committee of Social Development is holding a public clause-by-clause review of Bill 45, the Corrections Act. Bill 45, sponsored by the Department of Justice, repeals and replaces the current Corrections Act, a project considered the final piece of work in implementing the recommendations made by the Auditor General of Canada in 2015. Bill 45 received second reading in the Legislative Assembly on March 11, 2019, and was referred to the Standing Committee on Social Development for review. To commence its review of Bill 45, the committee sent letters inviting input from an extensive list of stakeholders, including all municipal and Indigenous governments in the Northwest Territories and a number of non-governmental organizations. During the week of May 13, 2019, the committee traveled to and held public meetings on Bill 45 in Fort Smith, Hay River, Fort Providence, Betchico, Inuvik, and Tuktoyaktuk. A final public hearing was held in Yellowknife on May 23, 2019. Committee thanks everybody who attended these meetings or provided written submissions to the committee sharing their views on Bill 45. As a result of the committee's consultation and feedback received, committee sent a letter to the Minister of Justice on July 31, 2019, expressing the intent to request an extension on the first sitting day of the August sitting. An extension was granted to report the bill back this coming Monday, August 16th, in order to provide more time for the committee, the minister, and the department to continue working collaboratively on changes that we believe should be made to the bill. Committee will be proposing 32 amendments to Bill 45. The details of submissions received by the committee and the nature of the committee's deliberations will be addressed in our report to be presented in the Legislative Assembly this week or next week. There are copies of the bill available at the back of the room. Committee would like to thank the Minister of Justice and the staff for the collaborative approach on review of Bill 45, and would like to thank Cabinet for granting the extension to ensure a proper, thorough review of the bill that we believe has been greatly improved for the people of the Northwest Territories. I will now invite the Honourable Minister of Justice to introduce himself and his staff for the record and proceed with any opening comments you may have. Minister Siebert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm pleased to be here today to discuss Bill 45, the Corrections Act. With me today are Martin Goldney, our Deputy Minister Justice, Ms. Kim Schofield, Assistant Deputy Minister Justice, Mr. Blair Van Meter, Director, Corrections Services, Mr. Ian Rennie, Legislative Counsel, and Ms. Heather Riviere, my Ministerial Special Advisor. The purpose of Bill 45 is to repeal and replace the current NWT Corrections Act, which is well over 40 years old. The changes proposed are intended to update NWT corrections legislation to bring it into line with the evolution in corrections over the past several years and incorporate the reformed practices and approaches that have emerged at the national and international levels. The bill makes a number of improvements to the current legislative framework of the corrections system in the areas of accountability, supporting the rehabilitation of offenders and their reintegration into the society, reducing the risk of reoffending and keeping our community safe. The bill recognizes the unique cultural background, historic legacy, and experience of offenders in the NWT and sets the framework for incorporating these elements into the rehabilitation process. The bill also includes operational improvements in the areas of risk management and security, quality assurance and monitoring, and staff training. Significant changes are being proposed in the new Act include provide for the establishment of independent community advisory boards, facilitate the involvement of Indigenous governments in the delivery of corrections programs and services, clarify the link between case planning and programming for remanded persons, sentenced offenders in facilities, and offenders in community-based programs, establish oversight by an Investigations and Standards Office, and provide for independent decision-making in disciplinary matters and the use of separate confinement. Increase authorities related to the search and monitoring of those in a correctional center or seeking to enter a correctional center. Provide for the establishment of a notification program that respects the rights of victims and includes victim-offender mediation program. Includes a victim-offender mediation program. Clarify the rules relating to the appropriate use of separate confinement, including fixing time limits, providing for independent oversight, and specifically defining the authorities for placement, and provide for the development of a corrections employee guide of conduct that employees and service providers are required to follow. I would like to thank committee members for their thorough review of the bill. I would also like to thank our respective officials for their collaboration and for going above and beyond to find mutually agreeable solutions to recommendations that have been brought forward by committee. I understand that this work has resulted in a number of motions that members of committee will be advancing today that will ultimately improve the bill. Mr. Chairman, I would be pleased to answer any questions members may have regarding Bill 45. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Does committee have any general comments or questions before we begin the clause-by-clause review? No. Seeing none, does committee agree to conduct a clause-by-clause review of the Bill 45 Corrections Act? Agreed. Thank you, committee. We will defer the title of the bill until the end and begin with consideration of the clauses. There are 60 clauses in a bill. We will group the clauses where possible. Please turn to page 8 of the bill. Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that the English version of Bill 45 be amended by brackets A, striking out Investigation and Standards Office, wherever it appears in each of the following provisions, and substituting Investigations and Standards Office. I, brackets I, the definition, Investigation and Standards Office in Clause 1, brackets double I, paragraph 2, brackets 4, bracket A, triple I, bracketed triple I, Clause 12, and the preceding heading, brackets IV, Clause 13, brackets 1, brackets B, striking out Investigation and Standards Office in subclause 13, brackets 3, and substituting Investigations and Standards Office, and bracket C, striking out Director of Investigation and Standards in paragraph 53, brackets D, and substituting Director of Investigations and Standards. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Boley. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister Siebert. Committee to Clause 1 as amended, does committee agree? Agreed. Okay. What's that? Agreed. No, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 1 of Bill 45 be amended by deleting the definitions Aboriginal peoples and staff member and adding the following definitions in alphabetical order. Health professional means a health professional as defined in Section 1, brackets 1 of the Mental Health Act. Professional. Indigenous peoples means Aboriginal peoples of Canada as defined in subsection 35, brackets 2 of the Constitution Act 1982. Separate confinement means holding an inmate apart from other inmates, but does not include disciplinary segregation as defined in subsection 38, brackets 1. Staff member A includes the Director of Corrections and the Director of Investigations and Standards. 2. Probation officers, correctional officers, and other officers appointed under paragraph 2, brackets 1, brackets C, and employees of the Department of Justice who exercise powers and perform duties under this Act, but B, does not include volunteers or persons engaged to provide services or agents or employees of those persons.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. Motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister has concurred. Committee to Clause 1 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
No. Sorry. Yeah, so. Okay, so committee agreed? Agreed. Okay, Clause 1 as motion.
I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following after Clause 1. 1.1, the purpose of the Northwest Territories Correctional System is to contribute to the maintenance of a just, peaceful, and safe society by A, carrying out sentences imposed by courts, B, providing for the safe, secure, and humane custody and supervision of inmates and offenders, and C, assisting the rehabilitation of inmates and offenders and their reintegration into the community with a view to enabling them to satisfactorily adjust to community living. 1.2, the following principles guide the Corrections Service in achieving the purpose described in Section 1.1. A, protect the public, hold inmates and offenders responsible and accountable, and promote the healing and rehabilitation of inmates and offenders and their reintegration into the community. B, ensure inmates are provided with a healthy, safe, secure, and humane living environment. C, ensure that the policies, programs, and practices developed or used under this Act are respectful of the dignity of individuals and take into account age, gender, cultures, and abilities of inmates and offenders wherever appropriate, including being responsive to the particular needs of women and individuals with special requirements. D, ensure that members of the Corrections Service conduct themselves lawfully, ethically, and professionally. E, ensure that staff members are given training opportunities wherever possible, including training respecting the cultural heritage and history of Indigenous peoples of the Northwest Territories. brackets 2, working conditions that encourage integrity and personal accountability, brackets 3, opportunities to effectively work with inmates and offenders, and brackets 4, opportunities to participate in the development of corrections policies and programs. F, ensure that any restrictive measures imposed on a person under this act are the minimum necessary for the protection of the public and other persons. G, ensure that disciplinary and corrective measures and other restrictive measures imposed on inmates under this act are applied in accordance with the law and respect procedural fairness. H, encourage opportunities by departments and public agencies of the government of the Northwest Territories, other governments, including governments of Indigenous peoples, organizations, and members of the public, to assist with the healing, rehabilitation of inmates and offenders and their reintegration into the community. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion. The motion, the question has been called. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Minister has concurred. Does committee to clause 1 as amended? Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you. Clause 2? Thank you. Clause 3, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that English version of Clause 3 of Bill 45 be amended by striking out Aboriginal peoples wherever it appears in each of the following provisions and substituting Indigenous peoples, bracket A, that portion of subclause 3, bracket 1, preceding paragraph, bracket A, and bracket B, subclause 3, bracket 3.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is ordered. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Those opposed? Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for concurring. Committee to clause 3 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you. Clause number 4, Mr. Bolio.
Pardon me. Excuse me. Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, thank you. I move that Bill 45 be amended in the portion of Clause 4, preceding paragraph A, by striking out Director of Corrections and substituting Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for concurring. Committee to clause 4 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you. Clause 5, Mr. Blake. Motion.
This, is it 6?
Yeah, it's clause 5.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 5 of Bill 45 be amended by striking out Director of Corrections in subclause brackets 1 and substituting Minister. Striking out Aboriginal peoples in the English version of subclause brackets 2 and substituting Indigenous peoples, and C, brackets, striking out Director of Corrections in subclause brackets 3 and substituting Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The motion is ordered. To the motion. The question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for concurring. To committee to clause 5 as amended. Does clause 5 as amended? Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. Clause 6 to 9. Agree. Thank you. Clause 10, Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 45 be amended by deleting subclause 10 brackets 1 and substituting the following: 10 brackets 1, the Director of Corrections shall adopt a code of professional conduct for all staff members. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion?
Question?
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Minister has concurred with this amendment. Committee to Clause 10 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 11, Mr. Natalie.
Mr. Chair, thank you. I move that Clause 11 of Bill 45 be deleted and the following substituted. 11 bracket 1, the director of corrections shall, subject to the regulations, establish, administer, and maintain a program respecting the rights of victims. Bracket 2, the director of corrections shall, subject to subsection bracket 3, and on the request of the victim of an offense for which an offender has been found guilty and in present disclose the following information about the offender to the victim or to the victim's designated representative. Bracket A, location of the correctional center of the imprisonment of imprisonment. Bracket B, length of sentence. Bracket C, any changes to sentence. Bracket D, any temporary absences. Bracket E, details about any transfer of the offender from the correctional center. Bracket F, details about the offender escaping or otherwise being unlawfully at large in any subsequent apprehension. Bracket G, release date from custody. Bracket H, the community where the offender is to be released. Bracket I, any other information that may be disclosed in accordance with the regulations. Bracket 3A, disclosure of information under subsection bracket 2 may be made for any purpose if the Director of Communications concludes that bracket A, the victim's interest in disclosure outweighs any invasion of privacy that could result from the disclosure, and bracket B, disclosure would benefit the victim. Bracket 4, if a provision of this section is inconsistent with or in conflict with the provision of the Access to Information and Protection of Privacy Act, the provision of this section prevails to the extent of the conflict. Bracket 5, the minister may establish other programs that employ the principles of restorative justice, including victim-offender mediation programs.
Natalie, the motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Natalie. Mr. Natalie?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion provides clear obligations on the part of the corrections system and clear entitlements on the part of the victims or their designates to have access to certain information about their perpetrators, where the disclosure would benefit the victim and their interest in disclosure outweighs any invasion of privacy that could result from the disclosure.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister, for concurring with the amendment. Committee to Clause 11 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clauses 12 to 14. Clauses 15, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I move that Clause 15 of Bill 45 be amended by striking out, by striking out alternate measures in the English version of paragraph brackets 2, bracket C, and substituting alternative measures. And B, adding the following after subclause 15, brackets 2. 3. If an inmate is unable to participate in programs or work under this act or requires special accommodation due to illness, disability, or injury, the person in charge shall make all reasonable efforts to accommodate the circumstance of the inmate. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? Those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Minister has concurred with the amendment. Committee to Clause 15 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. Clause 16, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by deleting paragraph 16 brackets 1 brackets F and brackets G and substituting the following. Brackets F shall assist in programming and post-release planning to support the community reintegration of offenders who will be supervised by probation officers in the community on release. G, shall provide offenders in the community with correctional intervention and rehabilitative programming with a view to assisting them to make a satisfactory adjustment to community living, and H, has such additional powers and duties as may be prescribed. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. Minister concurred with the amendment. Committee, Clause 16 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, Committee. Clause 17, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that subclause 17 brackets 1 of Bill 45 be amended by striking out offenders and substituting inmates and offenders. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister has concurred with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 17 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 18.
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 19, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by deleting Clause 19 and the preceding heading.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment? Thank you, Minister. The minister has concurred with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 19 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, Committee. Clause 20, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that subclause 20, brackets 2, of Bill 45 be amended by striking out the corrections service of the Northwest Territories and substituting the corrections service. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Minister, thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 20 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, Committee. Clause 21, Ms. Green. Oh, sorry, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 21 of Bill 45 be deleted and the following substituted. 21. Okay. Okay, a little correction there.
Mr. Blake?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As motion number 14 is more than 1 page in length, I move that this motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Blake. No. Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion amends the programs and services provisions of Bill 45, including to clarify that all inmates are entitled to participate in these programs and services, that programs and services may be offered in a community or on the land, and to provide for these services of an Indigenous elder or spiritual advisor.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister has concurred with the amendment. Committee, Clause 21 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, Committee. Clause 22 to 25?
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 26, Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, as motion 15 is more than one page in length, I move that this motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion, Ms. Green.
This motion establishes minimum living conditions and standards and ensures inmates have the right to peaceful assembly and religious expressions, subject to reasonable limits. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 26 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, committee. Clause 27, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 27 of Bill 45 be deleted and the following substituted. Rules and information for inmates, 27, bracket 1. A person in charge shall, subject to the regulations and with the approval of the Director of Corrections, make rules respecting bracket A, the conduct of inmates, bracket B, the activities of inmates, and bracket C, other matters necessary or advisable for the maintenance of order in and the good management of the correctional center. Bracket 2, the person in charge shall ensure that an inmate on his or her admittance to the correctional center is, bracket A, provided with a copy of the rules in writing or by some other means to ensure that the inmate understands the rules, and bracket B, provided with information about the following in writing or by some other means to ensure that the inmate understands the information. Bracket I, the rights and privileges of inmates. Bracket 2, the making of complaints by inmates. Bracket 3, discipline. Bracket 4, program and services. Bracket 5, any other matters reasonably necessary to enable the inmate to adapt to the operation of the correctional center. Bracket 3, inmates shall comply with the rules made under this section. Bracket 4, Section 38 applies if an inmate fails to comply with the rule made under this section.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister has concurred with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 27 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, committee. Clause 27, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Motion number 17 is more than one page in length. I move that the motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion adds clarity around the use of force, including how and when it will be used, and provides for the reporting of incidents involving the use of force, and it provides for security, and it provides for a security classification process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 27 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agreed.
Thank you, committee. Clause 28, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by deleting Clause 28 and the preceding heading and substituting the following. Enhanced Supervision Program 28 brackets 1. In order to ensure the safety, security, and order of a correction center, the Director of Corrections may, subject to the regulations, establish an enhanced supervision program for the purposes of determining the level of security, program, and area limitations, access restrictions, and other conditions of confinement required for an inmate. 2. An authorized person may, subject to the regulations, assign an inmate to an enhanced supervision program. 3. An inmate shall comply with the requirements of an enhanced supervision program to which he or she is assigned. 4. An authorized person may, subject to the regulation, assign an inmate within an enhanced supervision program to be a specific level of security, access restrictions, and other conditions of confinement. 5. An authorized person who assigns an inmate to an enhanced supervision program under subsection 2, or who assigns a specific level of security, access restrictions, and other conditions of confinement under subsection brackets 4, shall A, provide the inmate with a notice of the assignment, including reasons for the assignment, and B, given the inmate an opportunity to make representations should he or she decide to consent the assignment. 6. The authorized person shall, after considering any representations made by the inmate under paragraph A brackets B, A, confirm, quash, or vary the assignment, and brackets B, provide the inmate with the decision with reason. 7. An inmate may, subject to the regulations, appeal a decision by the authorized person under the section of the Director of Corrections.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The motion is ordered. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 28 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 29. Thank you. Clause 30. Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that the definition of privileged communication in subclause 30 brackets 1 of Bill 45 be amended by A, adding the paragraph after paragraph C, E.1, the Ombud or staff of the Ombud, a member of or staff of the Human Rights Commission, or a member of the Human Rights Adjudication Panel appointed under the Human Rights Act. Brackets B, striking out or at the end of the English version of paragraph F. C, bracket C, striking out the period at the end of paragraph G and substituting or and, brackets D, adding the following after paragraph G. H, other persons of a prescribed class. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes. At the first amendment, did I hear adding the following after paragraph? It's E, right? I thought I heard C, but
G.
The
G?
after brackets D, adding the following after paragraph G.
A, did I hear? E. Okay, that's fine.
Okay, so Minister, do you concur?
Yes, I do.
Okay, thank you, Minister. Minister concurs with the amendment. Committee, Clause 30 as amended.
Agreed.
Thank you. Committee agrees. Clause 31.
Agreed.
Thank you. Clause 32, Mr. Nettle.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. As motion 20 is more than 1 page in length, I move that this motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is in order. To the motion, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion clarifies that inmates in separate confinement, which refers to the holding of an inmate apart from other inmates for the purposes of safety and security rather than for disciplinary or corrective purposes, get to maintain their living conditions and standards and access to programs and services, but adapted to the circumstances of being separately.
Thank you.
Sorry, being held separately.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? Motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with amendment. Committee to Clause 32 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you. Clause 33, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following after subclause 33 brackets 4, brackets 5, an authorized person who conducts a strip search under this section must be of the same gender as the inmate, unless the person in charge believes on reasonable grounds that any delay necessary in order to comply with this requirement result in danger of human life or safety. 6, a strip search conducted under this section must be conducted in a place and manner that A, respects the dignity of the inmate, and B, does not subject the inmate to embarrassment or humiliation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is ordered. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with the amendment. Committee to Clause 33 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clause 34, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following after subclause 34 brackets 8 brackets 9. An authorized person who conducts a strip search under this section must be of the same gender as the visitor. Brackets 10. The strip search conducted under this section must be conducted in a place and manner that A, respects the dignity of the visitor, and B, does not subject the visitor to embarrassment or humiliation.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with the amendment. Committee to Clause 34 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clause 35, Ms. Green.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following after subclause 35 bracket 6, bracket 7. An authorized person who conducts a strip search under this section must be of the same gender as the staff member. Brackets 8, a strip search conducted under this section must be conducted in a place and manner that A, respects the dignity of the staff member, and B, does not subject the staff member to embarrassment or humiliation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with this amendment. Committee to Clause 35 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 36? Thank you, committee. Clause 37? Thank you, committee. Clause 38, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As motion 24 is more than 1 page in length, I move that this motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is ordered. To the motion, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion expands the procedures around discipline or corrective measures for inmates.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. Committee to Clause 38 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clause 39, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move that Bill 45 be amended by A, striking out subsection 38 bracket 6 in subclause 39, brackets 5, and substituting subsection 38, brackets 11, and B, striking out subsections 38, brackets 8 to brackets 10. In subclause 39, bracket 7, and substituting subsections 38, brackets 18, and brackets 20. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bully. The motion is in order. To the motion?
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 39 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. Clause 40, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by deleting Clause 40 and substituting the following. 40, brackets 1, the minister may appoint adjudicators. 2, an adjudicator must not be employed at a correctional center. Brackets 3, an adjudicator shall, subject to the regulations, A, preside over disciplinary hearings, B, review alleged breaches by inmates of this act, the regulations or the rules of a correctional center, C, make a determination respecting an inmate at a disciplinary hearing, D, determine appropriate disciplinary or corrective measures for breaches of this act, the regulations or the rules of a correctional center. E, review instances where a person in charge authorizes a disciplinary segregation of an inmate for more than 60 aggregate days in a 365-day period under subsection 38 brackets 14, and F, review the separate confinement of inmates under section 32 and determine whether such periods of confinement may have been varied. Brackets 4. Subject to the regulations, adjudicators may A, paid honorariums, and B, maybe A, paid honorariums, and B, reimbursed for reasonable expenses incurred in the exercise of powers and in performance of duties under this act.
Thank you, Mr. Blake. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 40 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you.
Okay, wait a second. Okay, here we go. Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following after Clause 40. Review of separate confinement by adjudicator, 40.1 brackets 1. This section applies where an adjudicator receives a request to review a requirement that an inmate be held in separate confinement for a period exceeding 96 hours under subsection 32 brackets 8 and carries out the review under paragraph 40 brackets 3 brackets F. Number 2, if on review of the request, the adjudicator decides to extend the period of separate confinement for the inmate, the adjudicator may extend the period for one or more periods, each of which must not exceed 7 days. Brackets 3, before making a decision on a review under this section, the adjudicator shall A, give the inmate a copy of the request for the review and the details of the requirement that the inmate be held in separate confinement. B, give the inmate a reasonable opportunity to retain legal counsel and make oral or written submissions to the adjudicator about why the requirement should be rejected or varied. And C, consider any examination report from a health professional made under paragraph 32 brackets 5 brackets B. Brackets 4, an adjudicator may, after carrying out a review under this section, terminate a requirement that an inmate be held in separate confinement if the adjudicator considers that such termination is conducive to the inmate's healing, rehabilitation, and community reintegration, and that any risk to any person at the correctional center is minimal. brackets 5, an inmate may appeal a decision of the adjudicator to the Director of Corrections within 7 days after receiving notice of the decision from the adjudicator. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 40 as amended, does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clauses 41 to 49?
Agree.
Thank you. Clause 50, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Clause 50 of Bill 45 be amended by bracket A, striking out minister may provide any in subclause bracket 1 and substituting minister shall authorize the provision and bracket B adding the following after clause bracket 3. Bracket 4, a person in charge may limit an inmate's access to any service referred to in subsection bracket 1 if the person in charge considers it is reasonable and necessary for the protection of security and the safety of persons at the correctional center.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is in order to the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with the amendment. Committee, Clause 50 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clause 51, Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 45 be amended in the English version of subclause 51, brackets 2, by striking out material and substituting material.
Thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Bo. Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order to the motion.
Question.
Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurred with the amendment. Committee, to Clause 51 as amended. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 52. Thank you, committee. Clause 53, Mr. Blake.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following clause after Clause 53. Complaints 53.1 brackets 1. In this section, complaint means an inmate, offender, or person on probation, conditional sentence, or judicial interim release who makes a complaint under this section. Brackets 2, the Director of Corrections shall, subject to the regulations, establish a process for making complaints about brackets A, the operation of a correctional center, including procedures for reporting and addressing complaints and reviews, and B, the provision of correctional programs and services at the correctional center or elsewhere. 3, a complaint or potential complaint is subject to the regulations entitled to A, make a complaint, B, receive timely information about the complaint and review process, C, receive a response to the complaint within a reasonable period, D, have a timely investigation into the complaint, E, make submissions, F, receive written reasons for decisions made in respect of the complaint, and G, have the complaint reviewed.
Mr. Blake, the motion is in order to the motion. Motion has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The minister concurs with this amendment. Committee, to Clause 53 as amended. Does committee agree?
Agree.
Thank you, committee. Clause 54?
Agree.
Thank you. Clause 55, Ms. Green.
Mr. Chair, I move that Bill 45 be amended by adding the following clause after Clause 55, Annual Report, 55.1, brackets 1. The Director of Corrections shall, within 4 months after the end of each fiscal year, make a report to the Minister on the administration of the Act for that fiscal year, including A, the number of inmates admitted to and released from each correctional centre, B, the number of offenders participating in rehabilitation programs as defined in Section 21, C, the number of instances of use of force under Section 27.1, D, the number of inmates held in separate confinement under Section 32, including details about how long they were so held, E, the number of inmates held in disciplinary segregation under Section 38, including details about how long they were so held, F, the number of hearings presided over by adjudicators, G, the number of complaints made under Section 53.1, and H, details about any judicial review where the decision of a staff member or an adjudicator was quashed, confirmed, or varied, or returned for reconsideration. Brackets 2, the Minister shall lay a copy of the report referred to in subsection 1 before the Legislative Assembly at the earliest opportunity after receiving the report. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Green. The motion is in order. To the motion? Question has been called. All in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the Minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The Minister concur with the amendment committee to Clause 55 as amended. Does committee agree? Agree. Thank you, committee. Clause 56, Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As motion number 32 is more than 1 page in length, I move that this motion be deemed as moved and read as written and distributed to members.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. The motion is in order. Mr. Natalie.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This motion amends the regulation making authority under the bill to account for the various other changes.
Thank you, Mr. Natalie. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Does the Minister concur with this amendment?
Yes.
Thank you, Minister. The Minister concurs with this amendment to committee to Clause 56. Does committee agree? Thank you, committee. Clause 57 to 60. Thank you, committee. We will now return to the bill number and title, Bill 45, Corrections Act. Does committee agree? Agree. Does the committee agree that Bill 45, Correction Act, is now ready for consideration in the Committee of the Whole? Mr. Bolio.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move that Bill 45 Corrections Act be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Bolio. The motion is in order. The motion is on the floor. To the motion. Question has been called. All those in favor? All those opposed? The motion is carried. Bill 45, Corrections Act, will be reported to the Assembly as ready for consideration in the Committee of the Whole as amended and reprinted. At this point in time, Minister, do you have any closing comments before we adjourn?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I know a tremendous amount of work has gone into this, and that work is apparent in the many motions improving the legislation. So I think we can all be justifiably proud of bringing this act into this century and this age. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Minister Siebert. On behalf of committee, I would like to thank the department and your staff for the great work you did. I mean, it was a lot of work and under some difficult situations, long hours, and I appreciate that. I'd also like to thank our staff who did an amazing job working with your staff and committee moving forward. To committee, I would like to thank you as well. I think this is a bill that we can all be very proud of, and as the minister said, moving this bill that's been overdue, been amended and long due. So at this point in time, I would like to thank everybody for watching, everybody who attended here publicly. I'd also like to thank the minister and your officials, and thank to everybody for this evening. We are now adjourned.